Adolf Hitler stood at the peak of his power. His armies had crushed much of Europe, his enemies seemed weak, and his people believed he was a mastermind who could do no wrong. The Nazi propaganda machine painted him as a military genius, a man who saw 10 steps ahead while the rest of the world struggled to keep up. His speeches were full of confidence, promising a future where Germany would rule for 1,000 years. But reality was different. Beneath the surface, cracks had already begun to form. His leadership was not as strong as it seemed. His closest allies were competing for power, some even questioning his decisions. His military victories were built on speed and surprise, but the deeper Germany pushed into war, the more stretched and vulnerable it became. Hitler himself was not the brilliant strategist people believed. He was reckless, stubborn, and ignored advice from his own generals. What followed were a series of mistakes that would cost Germany everything. Some were bad decisions made in the heat of war. Others were rooted in arrogance and blind ambition. Each misstep pushed the Nazis closer to disaster. This is the story of how Hitler, the man who seemed unstoppable, led his own empire to ruin. In the spring of 1941, something happened that no one in Nazi Germany could have imagined. Rudolf Hess, one of Hitler's closest allies, secretly got into a plane and flew to Britain alone. He wasn't shot down. He wasn't sent by Hitler. He had taken it upon himself to try and negotiate peace with the British. It was a desperate move, and one that made no sense to anyone who heard about it. When Hess landed in Scotland, the British were stunned. Was this some kind of trick? A secret plan from Hitler? Or was something deeper happening inside the Nazi leadership? At first, no one knew what to believe. Hess claimed he had come on a personal mission to end the war. But the British didn't take him seriously. To them, he sounded delusional, rambling about his importance and a deal that didn't exist. Back in Germany, Hitler was furious. This wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. Hess was one of the original Nazis, someone who had been by Hitler's side since the early days. Now, he had abandoned the party and flown straight into enemy hands. Hitler saw it as betrayal. He shouted rage and immediately cut Hess out of history, banning any mention of his name. But it was too late. Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda chief, had to come up with an explanation fast. He spread the story that Hess had lost his mind, that the pressure of war had made him snap. But many Germans weren't convinced. If Hess had truly gone insane, why had he been in such a powerful position for so long? This was the first time the public saw that the Nazi leadership wasn't as united as they claimed. It was the first real crack in the Third Reich's image, and that crack would only grow bigger. In June 1941, Hitler made the most ambitious move of his military career. He launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military attack in history, with over 3 million German soldiers, thousands of tanks, and aircraft flooding into Soviet territory. Hitler was confident. He had crushed Poland, France, and much of Europe with lightning-fast attacks. He believed the Soviet Union would be no different. At first, everything went according to plan. The German army tore through Soviet defenses, capturing city after city. Millions of Red Army soldiers were taken prisoner, and the Soviets seemed to be in complete chaos. Hitler was convinced the entire country would collapse within weeks. His generals, however, weren't so sure. They warned that the Soviet Union was too big, that their supply lines were stretched too thin, and that winter would come soon. But Hitler ignored them. In his mind, the Soviets were weak, and their defeat was inevitable. Then, the problem started. The Soviets refused to surrender. They burned their own cities, destroyed railroads, and retreated deep into their vast country, forcing the Germans to chase them. By the time winter arrived, the German army was completely unprepared. Temperatures dropped to minus 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Equipment froze. Fuel turned to ice. Soldiers who had expected a quick victory now had to survive in the brutal Russian cold with little food and no proper winter clothing. German troops began dying by the thousands, not from battle, but from the weather. Some froze to death overnight. Others starved, forced to eat whatever they could find. Meanwhile, the Soviets, used to the harsh conditions, launched counterattacks. The invincible German war machine was now stuck, bleeding soldiers and supplies every day. What was supposed to be Hitler's greatest victory was turning into a nightmare. He had underestimated the Soviet Union, ignored the warnings of his own generals, and walked straight into a war he could not win. This was the first military disaster of the war, but it would not be the last. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Within hours, battleships were in flames, and over 2,400 Americans were dead. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan. Across the Atlantic, Hitler now faced a choice. Should he stay out of it or join his ally in war against the most industrially powerful nation on Earth? He didn't think twice. Just 4 days later, Hitler declared war on the United States. No one had forced him. Japan hadn't even asked for his support. But Hitler saw America as weak, a country that had no real military strength and no stomach for war. He believed they were too divided, too focused on business, and too far away to be a real threat. In his mind, the U.S. would struggle to fight Japan in the Pacific, let alone take on Germany in Europe. He couldn't have been more wrong. With America now fully in the war, its factories began producing weapons at an unimaginable scale. Tanks, planes, and ships rolled off assembly lines by the thousands. Unlike Germany, which was constantly low on resources, the U.S. had an endless supply of men, money, and materials. While Hitler's armies were bogged down in the frozen battlefields of Russia, America was gearing up for a global war effort like nothing the world had ever seen. Then came the worst part. Hitler now had to fight a two-front war. His forces were already struggling to defeat the Soviets in the East. Now, American and British forces were preparing to strike from the West. Germany, which had relied on speed and surprise, was now surrounded. This was the turning point. Before this, Hitler still had a chance to win. But after declaring war on the U.S., Germany's days were numbered. He had overplayed his hand, and from this moment on, the war would no longer be on his terms. By the summer of 1942, Hitler was desperate for a decisive victory in the Soviet Union. His invasion had stalled, and the quick war he had promised was dragging into its second year. His new target was Stalingrad, a major industrial city on the Volga River. It wasn't just about strategy. Stalingrad carried Stalin's name, and Hitler wanted to take it as a personal blow to his greatest enemy. The battle that followed was unlike anything seen before. Instead of open battlefields, it was fought street by street, house by house, room by room. Soviet snipers hid in the rubble, picking off German troops one by one. Grenades and machine guns echoed through the ruins as both sides fought for control of every building. What should have been a swift German victory turned into a bloodbath. Then, in November, the Soviets struck back, launching a massive counterattack. They surrounded 300,000 German soldiers inside the city. Hitler's generals begged him to allow a retreat. If they didn't escape soon, they would all be wiped out. But Hitler refused. He ordered his men to fight to the last bullet. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, promised that German planes would deliver enough supplies to keep the army alive. It was a lie. The airlifts failed, and the soldiers inside Stalingrad began starving to death. Some resorted to eating horses, even rats, just to survive. Temperatures dropped below freezing, and frostbite took more men than Soviet bullets. By February 1943, the German army inside Stalingrad collapsed. The once mighty Wehrmacht surrendered, with nearly 100,000 German troops taken as prisoners. This was more than just a military loss. This was Germany's first major defeat of the war. For the first time, the illusion of Nazi invincibility was broken. Across Europe, people began to wonder, was Hitler really the genius they had believed him to be? As the war dragged on, the cracks in Nazi propaganda became impossible to ignore. Joseph Goebbels, the master of manipulation, worked tirelessly to maintain morale. But the truth was starting to break through. People were growing tired of the constant lies, and the destruction around them was undeniable. Cities like Hamburg were reduced to rubble after relentless bombing raids by the Allies. The air raids grew more frequent, and it wasn't just military targets being hit. The civilian population was suffering too. The once thriving cities were now burning shells of their former selves. This wave of destruction changed how many Germans saw the war. For years, they had been told of Germany's invincibility, of Hitler's genius. But now, those same people started to question everything. Whispers of doubt spread. Was Hitler really the genius they had been told he was? Were the Nazis really as powerful as they claimed? Or were they just as fragile as the cities crumbling around them? At the same time, resistance movements began to grow. Groups like the White Rose, made up of young Germans, openly challenged the regime. They printed leaflets urging people to stand up against the dictatorship, risking their lives to speak out. As public opinion turned against him, Hitler retreated into his bunker, out of touch with reality. He no longer interacted with the public or his people. Isolated and surrounded by yes-men, Hitler became more and more disconnected from the world outside. The once mighty figure who had captivated the masses was now a distant, paranoid leader hiding from the consequences of his own decisions. By the final years of the war, Hitler was no longer the powerful leader he once was. His health began to fail in ways that couldn't be ignored. Tremors shook his hands, and his once strong voice grew weaker. Paranoia took hold of him, and the signs of Parkinson's disease started to show. But rather than step back, he pushed forward, relying more and more on a mix of stimulants, painkillers, and experimental drugs to keep going. His personal doctor, Dr. Morel, filled him with these powerful substances, believing they would help, but they only seemed to make things worse. As his body deteriorated, his mind followed. Hitler's paranoia grew so intense that he could no longer trust anyone around him. He saw betrayal everywhere, even from his closest generals, who had served him loyally for years. He began to believe that they were conspiring against him, refusing to follow his orders, even when the war was clearly lost. Instead of facing the reality of the situation, Hitler continued to give impossible military orders, as if victory was still within reach. His generals were too scared to speak out, but they knew the truth. They were losing, and the Allies were closing in from all sides. Yet Hitler, stuck in his delusional world, refused to admit defeat. The change in him was obvious to the German people. The once great leader who had been worshipped like a god was now a shadow of himself. His speeches were no longer inspiring, and his decisions no longer made sense. The man who had once promised to lead Germany to greatness was now seen as a delusional wreck, clinging to power in the face of certain collapse. Hitler's downfall was not just the result of military defeat. It was the consequence of his own arrogance, paranoia, and refusal to face reality. His belief that he could control everything, that he was invincible, led him to make decisions that pushed Germany to the brink of destruction. His stubbornness blinded him to the warning signs, and his inability to listen to those around him sealed the fate of both himself and his empire. What started as a powerful, fear-driven regime eventually crumbled under its own weight. The Third Reich, built on lies, violence, and propaganda, collapsed, leaving behind nothing but devastation and broken dreams. The grand vision of a 1,000-year empire ended in ruins. The story of Hitler serves as a lesson from history. Dictators who refuse to listen to reason, who believe they are above all criticism, are doomed to fall. It's a harsh reminder that no matter how powerful someone becomes, ignoring reality will always lead to their downfall. Hitler once believed that he was destined to rule the world, that his vision would last forever. Instead, his name has become a warning, a symbol of the danger that comes when a leader ignores the truth and lets their ego dictate their choices. The rise and fall of Hitler is a powerful reminder that history never forgets.